Stuart Pallister from INSEAD Knowledge. Professor Porter, you've been speaking here a bit about how companies should face the economic downturn. What would be your best advice at the moment? So you seem to be saying that companies should try to take a long-term approach, but for many companies will be just looking at trying to survive right now.
Well, that's of course the paradox of economic downturns, is that every bit of pressure is pulling companies to doing whatever is necessary to survive, and of course ultimately companies have to survive, or they don't exist anymore. So in a sense one has to be pragmatic about survival, but I guess what we found over and over again is that to survive you actually have to have a capacity to sort of integrate the short term and the long term and think about the two together. And you can't take actions in the short term that seem expedient if they ultimately don't, if they ultimately undermine what's different or unique about the company. So, companies that really overreact to the downturn, I think, get themselves into big trouble. So, for example, in a downturn, the customer almost always gets more price sensitive. Partly because the customer is under pressure, but also partly because there's not many customers. And so the ones that exist know that they have power, so they beat down hard on the company to try to bargain a low price. Now, suppose the company is strategically really focused on providing excellent products with excellent service. You might think that because the customer is more price sensitive in the downturn, then the company should actually cut back on its service and on its features. But actually, that's probably the worst thing it could do, because then it will lose first of all, it will undermine its longer term success, and it will really become just like its competitors, who are all cutting price as well. So the paradox of downturns is that you have to sort of simultaneously kind of deal with the short term without forgetting the long term, and there's a number of different ways that I talked about that. The other kind of interesting point is that in normal times companies get a lot of scrutiny every quarter in terms of their profitability, and there's always pressure to kind of worry about the stock price. At times like this, actually, the stock price and the quarterly profit actually doesn't matter very much, because nobody's going to look good. And trying to look a little bit better when everybody's bad doesn't really get you much. So ironically, during these periods, companies often have more flexibility to make moves and to make investments than they do during more normal periods when they're getting more short-term scrutiny. So those are just a couple of comments that I think need to be put very much on the top of the mind. And I was trying to get the audience today to really not abandon all strategic thinking just because it's a period of economic stress.
You said that you think the substance of the US economy is strong still, very strong, I think is the way you put it. And what's happening at the moment mainly concerns the financial services sector. Why do you think that, given that there is a marked downturn, if not recession, in Europe and the US?
Yeah, I think the economic recession that we're likely to have is 100% due to the direct effects of the problems in the financial markets, which now are spreading because they've affected housing, they've affected credit, because they've affected liquidity. So, but all of this really came from the financial markets and then spread to affect other companies, many of whom were very strong, we're doing everything right, we're well capitalized, we're making good decisions, but they, all of a sudden they couldn't issue commercial paper, or all of a sudden, their demand for their products dried up, not because their products weren't good, but because the consumers were foreclosing. Foreclosures were happening. So this is a very odd economic downturn. In the U.S. there's no evidence that productivity is not growing. Innovation, exports were quite strong. U.S. companies were very successful in their global strategies, getting a good market share in China and India. There's a lot of new companies being formed, a lot of heavy investments in new technologies. So, the fundamental reality of the economy was quite strong, but there was sort of a cancer, and the cancer grew and grew, and it was kind of ignored, and that cancer started spreading. And it was so substantial, and it froze the markets so much that it inevitably now has affected the rest of the economy. So it's we had an internet bubble in the early part of the 2000s, and that was caused by companies that weren't fundamentally economically sound. And they weren't making profits, and it was hype about a set of companies in the technology sector, and so that was a very different situation than we have today. Here, it's not fundamentally the companies in most of the economy that are the problem. It's the cancer spreading from the bad decisions and over leverage, partly of the consumer, but mostly in mortgages and in over leveraging in the financial sector.
Just wanted to ask about your seminal works from 1980, 1990, been used by business schools like ours, like Harvard Business School. Mm-hmm. How have you updated your five forces framework? You said you've been looking at that this year.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think again, this is always a dangerous thing to say, but again, I've spent quite a bit of time over the last couple of years kind of revisiting the industry structure model, and I've been this work has been taught and used in practice, in many industries, and I've participated in some and in some cases, and many others have taken on the life of their own. So we've kind of applied these ideas many times and had a chance to kind of learn and develop. And as I re-examined those ideas, I found some areas where we could add depth and actually some additional sort of rigor in a few areas. One example, for example, was in the areas of barriers to entry. Barriers to entry, in 1980, were primarily on the supply side, and they had to do with the economies of scale in terms of production or R&D or supply or whatever. What we found as we kind of looked at what's happened since, partly because of the IT revolution, is that there's another really important case of barriers to entry that really come from the demand side around network effects that have to do with the sort of classic Microsoft type network effects, where when many people are using a product on the demand side, it creates a tremendous barrier to entry for anybody else to put a new product into that industry. So that's an example of how there's a part of industry structure now, because of technological evolution, that's more important than it would have been on average. In rivalry, in the nature of rivalry, I think we've come to understand that we can think about rivalry in a more sophisticated way now than we could 20 or 25 years ago. But we also came to the conclusion that there had been a number of proposals that there should be a sixth force, and one of those was government. Another was complementary products, and And after a lot of debate and a lot of thinking and a lot of discussions, we really came to the conclusion that actually none of those were actually the sixth force, and that really there was only five. And again, this article talks about why it is that we reached that conclusion. So I guess I would say that my frameworks, whether they're the value chain or the five forces or the diamond, a theory, or clusters, are not really trying to capture trends or the latest technology or the latest circumstances. They're meant to really model, if you will, the sort of deep fundamentals, and to provide a set of tools by which you can look at any set of trends at any moment in time and try to make sense about their significance for competition. So of course, we keep learning about competition, and it takes new forms, and there's new technologies. But what I've always tried to do in my work is really be independent of the particular moment in time or the particular set of technologies that are emergent today, and really try to focus one level deeper. And so in that sense, I've found that the frameworks have themselves have not required sort of any fundamental modification as of now. In fact, the opposite. What I found is you can take the same frameworks and really apply them to look at new things like the internet, or recently in healthcare. I found that the problems we're having in healthcare delivery reflect the fact that we've not looked actually fundamentally at how value is created in healthcare, and we haven't had concepts like the value chain applied to that field. And when we apply those fundamentals, we get really new insights into the topic. So again, there are many different kinds of work that are important and relevant to informing managers, and I don't pretend to do it all, but rather focus on a sort of a certain way of looking at some very big, complicated problems that I think has been proven to be relatively not independent of time, but rather have quite a long shelf life, if you will, in terms of looking at some of these questions. So that's the nature of the work.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.